My daughter-in-law forged my late wife's signature on a deed transfer. When I found out, I said nothing. 3 days later, I mailed her a small package. She texted me that afternoon, "Thank you for finally being reasonable." She hadn't opened it yet. I was sorting through Eleanor's jewelry box when I found the first discrepancy. 41 years of marriage, and I still couldn't bring myself to move her things from the nightstand. It had been 14 months. The grief counselor said there was no timeline. I was beginning to think she was right. The jewelry box had a false bottom. Eleanor's idea, not mine. She'd kept important documents there since the 80s, when we'd had a break-in on Maple Street and lost her mother's pearls. After that, she said, the things that matter go somewhere unexpected. I'd forgotten about the compartment entirely until the box slipped from my hands and the bottom panel came loose. Inside was an envelope. My name on the front in Eleanor's handwriting. Dated 8 months before she died. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time before I opened it. The letter was 4 pages, front and back, written in her careful schoolteacher script. She wrote about the house on Birchwood Lane, the one we bought in 1987 for $94,000 and spent 30 years turning into something worth loving. She wrote about how she'd noticed money disappearing from our joint savings account. Small amounts at first, $200 here, $350 there, then larger. She'd traced it back 18 months before she wrote the letter, before the diagnosis, before everything collapsed. She wrote, "I think it's Renata. I don't know how to tell you. You love Marcus so much, and he loves her. But something is wrong, and I can't prove it, and I'm afraid of what happens if I'm wrong, and I say something anyway." She found a document in Marcus's desk drawer while looking for the car insurance card. A deed amendment. Our house. Her signature at the bottom. She hadn't signed anything. I read the letter 3 times. Then I walked downstairs, put on a pot of coffee I wouldn't drink, and stood at the kitchen window watching the Hendersons' dog bark at a squirrel until it got bored and walked away. Marcus was 43 years old. My son. I'd coached his little league team. I'd driven him to saxophone lessons every Tuesday for 6 years, even though neither of us thought he had any talent, because he wanted to try, and I believed you let kids try. I'd helped him move 4 times, including the last time, when he married Renata in that garden ceremony in Asheville, and I stood at the altar next to him and thought, this is what it was all for. That was 6 years ago. Renata had been attentive at first. After Eleanor's diagnosis, she'd organized the medication schedule, set up a color-coded binder, driven Eleanor to appointments when I had my knee replacement. I told Marcus he'd married well. I'd meant it. The first time she asked about the house was at Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. Just a question, casual. Wondering about our estate planning, whether we'd thought about putting the property in a trust for tax purposes. I'd said we had a lawyer. Everything was handled. Changed the subject. 3 months later, she mentioned a friend whose parents had lost significant assets to probate. Very sad. Very preventable. She had a notary in her office if we ever needed anything signed conveniently. I had appreciated her concern. Told Eleanor about it that evening. Eleanor had gone quiet in a way I recognized but didn't pursue. Now I understood the quiet. I called my accountant first. Retired, like me, but he owed me a favor from the county commissioner campaign we both worked on back in 2019. I read him the account numbers from Eleanor's letter. He called back in 2 hours. The transfers traced to a business account registered in Renata's maiden name. The business had no website, no employees, no registered address beyond a P.O. box in Asheville. $43,000. Moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic flags. That night, I drove past Marcus and Renata's house on Sycamore Drive. The lights were on. I could see them through the dining room window, eating dinner, talking. Normal. Comfortable. Renata laughing at something Marcus said. I went home and called my older brother in Flagstaff. Walt is 71, a retired civil engineer, and the least sentimental person I've ever known, which is exactly what I needed. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. which for Walt is an act of real discipline. When I finished, he said, "Have you called a lawyer yet?" "I wanted to call you first." "Call a lawyer in the morning. Don't call Marcus. Don't call Renata. Don't say a word to anyone else." He paused. "And Raymond, I'm sorry about Eleanor. I'm sorry she carried this alone. I hadn't cried since the funeral." "I didn't cry then either, but it was close." The lawyer's name was Patricia Okafor. She'd been recommended by 2 different people independently, which I've always taken as a sign. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a view of the river and a waiting room that smelled like good coffee and money. She reviewed everything I'd brought: Eleanor's letter, the bank statements my accountant had compiled, the photographs I'd taken of the deed amendment Marcus hadn't known I'd found years earlier while looking for the property survey. She asked good questions. She didn't react emotionally to any of it, which I found reassuring rather than cold. She'd clearly heard worse. "The deed amendment is the most serious piece," she said. "If your wife's signature is forged, that's felony fraud. The financial transfers are potentially elder financial abuse, which carries additional penalties in the state." She set down her pen. "Is your son involved?" "I don't know." "That's the right answer," she said. Not, "I don't think so." Not, "He would never." "You don't know." We proceed accordingly. She told me not to confront either of them, not to discuss it with Marcus, not to post anything online, not to change my behavior in any way that might signal I'd found something. She wanted a handwriting expert to review Eleanor's signature on the deed. She wanted a forensic accountant on the financial transfers. Both would take time. "Can you be patient?" she asked. I was 67 years old. I'd waited 6 years through Eleanor's illness. I'd been waiting 14 months in an empty house for the grief to change shape. I told her patience was about the one thing I had left. "Good," she said, "because if we move too fast, we lose the case, and you deserve to win this one." I drove home through the October afternoon, leaves turning along Birchwood Lane, the maple in the front yard that Eleanor had planted from a sapling in 1991, now taller than the house. I sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. My daughter called that evening. Sophie, 40, a physical therapist in Colorado, had no idea any of this was happening. I'd promised Patricia I wouldn't tell her yet. It was the hardest part of the conversation with myself that night, deciding to keep it from Sophie, who had adored her mother and would be devastated twice when she learned the full shape of things. I told her I was fine, organizing the house, thinking about the community garden in the spring, all of it true enough. She said, "You sound tired, Dad." I said, "I am, but it's the okay kind." She didn't believe me, but she let it go. 6 weeks later, Patricia called. The handwriting expert had submitted his report. Eleanor's signature on the deed amendment was inconsistent with 14 authentic samples in 9 identifiable ways. In his professional opinion, the signature had been traced or reproduced from another document. He would testify to that conclusion. The forensic accountant had traced all $43,000. The transfers were methodical, patient, and deliberate. Someone who knew how bank monitoring worked. Renata worked in banking for 11 years, Patricia said, before she opened her consulting business. I already knew that. I had attended the retirement party when she left the bank, brought a fruit basket, given her a card that said something about new beginnings. "There's one more thing," Patricia said. She paused in a way that meant she was deciding how to say something. The P.O. box for her business account. We had an investigator check the address history. The same address was used 4 years ago for a different business registered in a different state. That business was the subject of a civil complaint. Elderly widow. $40,000 transferred over 18 months. The case was settled quietly. Sealed. Same pattern. Different family. Before us. "She's done this before," I said. "It appears so." I sat in Eleanor's chair, the one by the reading lamp, where she'd graded papers for 30 years. The chair still had the slight lean to the left that she'd created. I thought about the other widow. Someone's mother. Someone's grandmother. Taken apart the same careful way, probably also by someone who'd brought fruit baskets and color-coded medication binders. "What do we do?" I asked. "We move forward," Patricia said. "Carefully, completely." I had one task before we filed. Patricia had asked me to retrieve the original property deed from the bank lockbox and bring it to her office. Standard procedure for the filing. Marcus called the afternoon before I planned to go to the bank. He wanted to come by for dinner, just the two of them, he said. He had something he wanted to talk about. I said, of course. Come Thursday. I'll make the pot roast your mother used to make. He arrived alone. Renata had a work thing, he said, apologetic. As if I'd be disappointed, I set 2 places at the table. We ate. He talked about work, his department's reorganization, a colleague retiring. He seemed relaxed, normal. Halfway through dinner, he mentioned the house. "I've been thinking," he said, "about your estate planning. I know you and Mom had things set up a certain way, but with the market the way it is, there might be some advantages to revisiting the property structure. Renata knows a good attorney who does real estate trust work." I watched his face. He was delivering the message cleanly, smoothly. I couldn't tell if he believed it himself or knew exactly what he was carrying. I said, "That's thoughtful. Let me think about it." He seemed relieved. Changed the subject to the Braves. After he left, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes and tried to decide what I believed about my son. The question didn't resolve itself. It just stayed there, uncomfortable and necessary. 2 days later, I went to the bank, retrieved the deed, brought it to Patricia. She filed the complaint the following morning. The package I sent Renata contained a single document, the summons. Fraud, forgery, elder financial exploitation. I'd included a handwritten note that said simply, "The original deed is with my attorney. The handwriting report is with my attorney. The banking records are with my attorney. See you in court." I sent it certified mail. Required censored it. She signed for it on a Tuesday at 11:14 a.m. Her text arrived at 3:47 p.m. "Thank you for finally being reasonable." She still thought it was money. At 4:02 p.m., a second text. No words. Just 3 dots that appeared and disappeared 4 times. At 4:11 p.m., Marcus called. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 40 seconds of silence, followed by his voice saying my name once, then the recording ending. Patricia told me what would happen next. The calls, the texts, the requests for meetings. She'd told me not to respond to any of them. Forward everything to her. Don't engage. Don't explain. Don't justify. It was harder than it sounds, not explaining. 67 years old, and I still had the reflex to smooth things over, make people comfortable. I'd spent a marriage doing it well. It was not, it turned out, always a virtue. The calls from Marcus came every day for the first week. I didn't answer. His texts escalated from confused to hurt to angry, then back to confused. He didn't seem to understand what was happening, which either meant he was a good actor, or he genuinely didn't know the full scope of what Renata had done. On day 8, he came to the house. I opened the door because he was still my son. Whatever else was true. He looked like he hadn't slept. He said, "Dad, tell me this is a misunderstanding." I said, "Come inside." We sat in the living room. He sat in the chair across from Eleanor's. I told Patricia I wouldn't discuss the case, but I hadn't promised not to show him his mother's letter. I placed it on the table between us. He read it slowly. Read it again. His hands were very still, which was something he'd inherited from me, the way we go quiet when things are serious. When he finished, he looked up. His face was the same face from Little League, from the saxophone lessons, from the wedding in Asheville, the same face, now doing something with itself that I'd never seen before. "I didn't know about the deed," he said. "I believe you." "I didn't know about any of it." "I believe that too." "But you're still. She forged your mother's signature. She stole from us while your mother was dying. She's done it to another family before ours. I kept my voice even. It wasn't difficult. The evenness had been with me since I found Eleanor's letter. Grief has a clarifying effect, eventually. This isn't about punishing you, Marcus, but it's also not something I can let go. He sat for a long time. The maple tree outside the window moved in the October wind. What do I do? He said. That's a question for your own lawyer. He left an hour later. He didn't defend Renata. He didn't ask me to drop anything. He just walked out to his car slowly, like someone learning a new way to move through the world. The preliminary hearing was a formality, but I went. I'm old enough to understand that formalities matter, that the ritual of accountability has weight beyond its legal function. Renata arrived with an attorney I recognized from the news, someone expensive. She wore a charcoal blazer. She didn't look at me. Patricia presented the handwriting analysis, the banking records, the connection to the previous civil complaint. Renata's attorney objected 3 times. The judge sustained none of them. 2 things happened that I hadn't anticipated. The first, Sophie flew in from Colorado without telling me. I found her on my front porch when I came home from the hearing. She'd read the public filing online, which I hadn't thought about being public, and had booked a flight that morning. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. When she finally pulled back, her face was furious and grief-stricken simultaneously. The particular combination that I'd seen on her at Eleanor's funeral when she was trying to be strong and couldn't quite hold it. Mom knew, she said. Yes. She was protecting Marcus. Yes. Sophie looked out at the maple tree. That sounds exactly like her. We stood on the porch in the cold for a while. Across the street, the Hendersons were raking leaves. Ordinary afternoon. Some days ordinary afternoon. Some days ordinary as to most unbearable. The second unexpected thing. 3 weeks before trial, a man named Gerald Fontaine contacted Patricia's office. He was 64, a retired pharmacist from Greenville, South Carolina. His mother had been the other case, the sealed civil complaint. She died in 2021. He'd spent 2 years trying to prove what happened, and been told, eventually, to accept the settlement and move on. He'd seen the public filing. He wanted to testify. Patricia called me about it that evening, and I could hear in her voice something she was trying to keep professional. His testimony would establish a pattern of behavior. It's significant. I asked if he'd be willing to talk to me directly. Gerald Fontaine called the next morning. He had a voice like a man who'd spent a long time being careful about what he said, measuring words before releasing them. He told me about his mother, retired schoolteacher, widowed. Trusted the wrong person in the middle of grief, when the defenses are down and the kindness of strangers feels like grace. I thought about Eleanor's letter. I don't know how to tell you. I'm afraid of being wrong. My mother was ashamed, Gerald said. Like she'd done something foolish. She hadn't. She'd just been decent and someone used that against her. I said, Eleanor was ashamed too. She died with it. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I'm glad you're fighting this, Gerald said. Anything for a moment. I'm glad you're fighting this, Gerald said. I wish I'd fought harder. Trial came on a Wednesday in February. Patricia had prepared me for what courtrooms actually feel like, which is nothing like television. Smaller, quieter, more procedural. The language of it, careful and slow. Gerald Fontaine flew up from Greenville. He sat in the gallery behind me, which felt right. Patricia was precise and methodical. She introduced the handwriting expert, who explained in clear terms what the 9 inconsistencies indicated. She introduced the forensic accountant, who walked the jury through 18 months of transfers and a timeline that made the pattern unmistakable. She introduced Eleanor's letter, which the judge allowed as documentary evidence. When the letter was read aloud in the courtroom, I looked at my hands. Marcus sat 3 rows behind Renata's table. He'd filed for divorce 6 weeks earlier. His face during the trial was the face of someone learning the full shape of something they'd only seen part of before. I recognized it because I'd worn it myself, sitting on the edge of the bed with Eleanor's letter in my lap. Renata's attorney argued that the signatures were similar because Eleanor had reviewed and approved the document verbally. that the financial transfers were gifts, voluntarily made. He was skilled. He made arguments that, in isolation, sounded almost reasonable. But Gerald Fontaine testified calmly about a woman in Greenville who'd made similar gifts to a similar business registered in a similar P.O. box, and the defense had no answer for the geography of coincidence. Sophie testified to Eleanor's character, her precision, her distrust of shortcuts. The fact that she'd kept 40 years of financial records organized by quarter in labeled folders. My mother, Sophie said, would never have signed something she didn't read, review, and understand. She would have called her attorney first. She was not someone who approved things verbally. Renata didn't testify. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on the fraud charge. Guilty on forgery. Guilty on forgery. Guilty on elder financial exploitation. Sentencing was 60 days later. 18 months, minimum security. 5 years probation. Restitution of the full $43,000 plus legal costs. The house deed would be restored to its correct form. After the verdict, Patricia shook my hand in the marble hallway outside the courtroom. She said, "You were patient. I had good help." She smiled. "You also didn't post anything on social media, which is rarer than you'd think." I found Gerald in the parking lot. He was standing by a rental car, looking at his phone. We shook hands. He seemed lighter than he'd sounded on the phone, like something that had been braced against something else for a long time had finally let go. "Thank you for making the call," I said. "Thank you for filing," he said. "It mattered. To me and to her." He meant his mother. I understood. Sophie drove me home. She stayed for a week, which turned into 2. We cooked Eleanor's recipes together, the ones in the index card box with Eleanor's handwriting on each card. The grease stains and flour marks that meant decades of actual use. We watched old movies. We raked the leaves, finally, in November. Very late, the yard having gotten away from me. Marcus came by on a Saturday. I told Sophie he might. She went for a walk and gave us an hour. He sat at the kitchen table where he'd sat for 40 years of Saturday breakfasts. He looked like he'd lost weight, like the rearrangement inside him was still in progress. He said, "I keep thinking about what Mom wrote, about being afraid of being wrong." So do I. She could have told me. She was protecting you. I didn't need protecting. I needed the truth. I thought about that. We don't always know what we need, I said. She did her best with the information she had and the fear she had. That's all any of us can say. He looked at his hands. Was it worth it? All of it? I'd been asked that kind of question before, in different forms, in the months since Eleanor's letter. Worth it measured against what? Against losing 30 years of knowing who my son's wife was? Against learning that someone patient and kind and organized had been using our grief as a mechanism? Against the fact that Eleanor had died carrying something heavy and alone? Your mother spent the last 2 years of her life worried she'd done something wrong by not speaking up, I said. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been stolen from. The least I could do was make sure the record showed that clearly. Marcus nodded slowly. Not satisfied, exactly. Adjusted to something. We had coffee. He stayed for lunch. When he left, he hugged me in the doorway, the same way he used to as a kid, without warning and completely the way children hug before they learn to be careful about it. I stood in the doorway after his car pulled out and watched the maple tree in the front yard, bare now, its branches clear against the February sky. Eleanor had planted it as a sapling in the early 90s, from a seedling a colleague had given her at the end of the school year. She'd chosen the spot carefully, measured the distance from the house, accounted for how large it would eventually grow. She was always thinking about the future shape of things, even then. I went inside, put on coffee, sat in her chair by the reading lamp. It doesn't resolve cleanly. That's the thing that'll tell you about justice. It's not a door closing. It's more like a window opening in a cold room. The air that comes in is necessary and real, but you still feel the temperature. Eleanor's letter is in the fireproof box now, with the other documents that matter. The jewelry box is on the dresser, where it's always been. The false bottom is closed. I think about her most in the mornings, the way she'd already have coffee made before I came downstairs, already at the table with a book, comfortable in the quiet. I think about what she was carrying those last 2 years, alone, trying not to add weight to mine. I would rather she'd told me. I understand why she didn't. The maple is bare through February, but it'll come back in the spring. It always does. Eleanor counted on that. People ask me sometimes if I regret how long it took. Not the filing, not the trial. The waiting. The 6 weeks between finding Eleanor's letter and walking into Patricia's office. The months of saying nothing at Sunday dinners while Renata passed the breadbasket and asked how I was sleeping. I don't regret it, and I've thought about why. There's a kind of patience that comes from weakness. The patience of someone who doesn't know what else to do. And there's a different kind that comes from understanding that moving too fast destroys the very thing you're trying to protect. What I had, eventually, was the second kind. It didn't feel like strength when I was living it. It felt like holding very still while something painful worked its way through me. But it held. And because it held, the case held, the evidence held, the truth held. Renata was patient, too, in her own way. That's the part I've had to sit with. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. She built something over years. The trust. The access. The timing. She waited until Eleanor was sick, until I was distracted by grief, until the moments when a signature here or a transfer there would barely register against everything else that was falling apart. She understood that people in pain aren't paying close attention. She used that, and she'd done it before. To someone else's mother, in another state, another family that loved and trusted and didn't see it coming. That's not bad luck. That's a choice, made deliberately, repeated. And choices like that have weight that eventually lands somewhere. It landed in a courtroom in February, in a verdict read aloud while Gerald Fontaine sat 3 rows behind me and my daughter flew in from Colorado because some things you don't let your father face alone. I think about Marcus. I think about what it cost him to sit in that courtroom and watch the full shape of what he'd married. He didn't know everything. I believe that. But there were things he'd half seen and half known and chosen not to press on, because pressing would have been uncomfortable, and comfort has a way of making cowards of decent people. He's working through that now in his own time, with his own lawyer and probably his own grief counselor. I'm not his judge. I'm his father. Those are different jobs. What I know is this. Eleanor spent 2 years carrying something heavy because she was afraid of being wrong, afraid of what the truth would cost the people she loved. She was the most careful, most decent person I've ever known, and even she, hesitated because kindness trained her to protect everyone else's feelings before her own safety. I wish I could tell her that she wasn't wrong, that the document she found was exactly what it looked like, that her instincts were right and she had nothing to be ashamed of. I can't tell her. So I did the next closest thing. I made sure the record shows it clearly so she doesn't carry it anymore, even in memory. Wisdom isn't knowing everything in advance. It's being willing to look at what's in front of you, even when it's painful, even when it rearranges everything you thought you understood. Intelligence without that willingness is just cleverness in the service of comfort, and the courage to act on what you see, not out of anger, but out of something quieter and more durable. That's what gets you through the long stretch between discovery and resolution. The maple is coming back this spring. Eleanor knew it would.